Welcome, everybody. Welcome to my talk about modern authentication solutions. I am Manfred Steyer. I work and live in Austria, and I am a consultant as well as a trainer in the area of web and service development. I also write from time to time. My last book was about AngularJS at O'Reilly. So what are the contents of this talk? I want to give a motivation towards modern authentication scenarios, and then I want to give an overview of OAuth 2 as well as of OpenID Connect. And then I will show you a demonstration I have prepared beforehand. So let's start with the motivation. In this world, every user has to maintain several user accounts. Nearly every application, every business application, and every web application we use demands on managing an own user account. And as you know, that gives us a very hard time. In addition to that, there are more and more applications that want to access some services, some back-end services on behalf of us. And when it comes to applications we not fully trust, when it comes to applications that we have downloaded from some application store or from the internet, we don't feel comfortable by typing in our password into those applications. And this is exactly where OAuth 2 comes in. OAuth is a solution that has been developed by Twitter and Magnolia, and it is a standard for the delegation of restricted rights. That means using OAuth, you can give an application some restricted rights, for instance, the rights to do some use cases on behalf of you at Twitter, at Facebook, or within some business application. And OAuth is quite popular. It has been adopted by huge companies like Google, Facebook, Flickr, Microsoft, and so on. When you look at OAuth, there are several roles. For instance, there is the client that wants to access some server that is called resource server on behalf of the user. And of course, there is the user that is called resource owner when it comes to OAuth 2. Neither the client nor the resource server have access to the user accounts. There are central user accounts, and only an instance called the authorization server has access to these user accounts. When you look at OAuth from a high-level perspective, everything begins with the client redirecting the user to the authorization server. And as part of this redirection, the client transmits a variable called scope. This scope denotes the rights the client wants to have from the user. And when the user arrives at the authorization server, the user has to log in, and then the authorization server asks the user, do you really want to delegate this and that rights to this and that client? And then the user says no, and we've done. Thank you for this. No, wait a minute. Or the user says yes, of course. This client can have this or that rights, and then the user is redirected back to the client. And as part of this redirection, the client gets an access token. And the client can use this access token to access the resource server on behalf of this user. You can think about an access token like about some visa or like about some passport or driver's license. This token gives the client the permission to act on behalf of the user. And this brings some advantages into play. For instance, with this scenario, you can use central user accounts. You can have one and only one user accounts for one user, and this user can use those user accounts for several clients as well as for several resource servers. And in addition to that, you only have to put in your password at the side of the authorization server. You don't have to put in your password at the client, which is especially useful when it comes to situation where you don't fully trust your client. The details regarding the communication between the client and the authorization server depends on the flow you choose. OAuth 2 defines several flows for several use cases. For instance, there is a flow called authorization code grant. This flow has been designed for server-side web applications. And in addition to that, there is also another flow. It is called implicit grant, and this flow has been designed for applications like single-page applications. In my demonstration, I will focus on this implicit grant. So let's talk about authentication scenarios with OAuth 2. Until now, we've just seen how to use OAuth 2 to delegate some rights, but OAuth 2 can also be used for authentication, for logging in the user. And when it comes to logging in the user, everything is about to help the client to find out who the user is. And for this, the client just requests a token that gives the permission to read the user profile. And when the client got this token, the client can use this token to access the resource server and to read the profile of the current user. So that is all the client has to do to find out who the user is. The issue with that is that the user profile isn't defined by OAuth 2. OAuth 2 just defines the communication between the client and the authorization server. OAuth 2 doesn't define anything about the resource server or about user profiles. And that is exactly where OpenID Connect comes in. OpenID Connect is an extension of OAuth 2, and it defines how to use OAuth 2 for authentication scenarios. It defines how to query a user profile, and it also defines that the client gets a so-called identity token. Identity token is a JSON web token. Just think of it like a JSON document that consists of some information about the user, username, email address, company, and so on. And this token can be signed by the issuer, that is the authorization server. And in addition to that, OpenID Connect shuts down some security holes that can arise when you are using OAuth 2 for authentication scenarios. When you are doing OAuth 2, or when you are doing OpenID Connect, you are just doing OAuth 2, and as a result of this, you don't only get an access token, you get an identity token that helps the client to find out who the user is. So the identity token is primarily for the client, and the access token is the token we got via OAuth 2, and this token is, as mentioned before, for the service. With this token, the client can access the service on behalf of the user. So let's look at a demonstration I've prepared forehead. This demonstration is about a simple Angular application that provides us to buy some vouchers. And when I click on voucher, I can buy a voucher. And for buying a voucher, I have to be logged in. Therefore, I click on login, and then I'm redirected to an authorization server. I am already logged in this authentication server. This authentication server bases on Identity Server 3, which is a very nice open source project for building your own authorization server or authentication server. And this server asks if I want to delegate some rights to the client. The client wants to have the right to read my user ID. It wants to have the right to read my user profile, things like my first name, my last name, and so on. And this client wants to have the right to buy vouchers in my name. And then I say, yes, I want to delegate all these rights to my client. and then the client gets two tokens. It gets the identity token, and this identity token helps the client to find out who I am, and it gets an access token, and it can use this access token to buy a voucher in my name. So let's try that. Let's buy a voucher. We see that I can access some backend service, some resource server, and when I present my token to this resource server, then I get a voucher. Okay, that's great. Let's just do the same example by the usage of Fiddler. Fiddler is a very small HTTP proxy that helps me to capture all the HTTP traffic I'm causing. So let's go to my demo application. Let's go to voucher. Let's log out and let's just log in. So here I have to provide my password and my username, and then I say that the current application gets all those rights. Yes, I allow gotchas. And then I will buy some voucher. So let's have a look at the HTTP traffic I'm caused. Here we see the redirection to the identity server. And we look at the protocol information. We see that I'm transmitting a lot of parameters using the query string to the identity server. And here is a better view for that. When we look at this, we see that my client is transmitting things like the ID of the current client to the authorization server. The client is transmitting its own address to the authorization server. The address we are redirected after we've logged in. And we see here that there is some scope transmitted. And as mentioned before, this scope denotes which rights the client wants to have from the user. In this case, the client wants to have the right OpenID. That means it wants to have the right to read the ID of the current user. It wants to have the right profile. That means it wants to read the user profile. It also wants to read the email address of the current user. And of course, the client wants to have the right to buy a voucher in the name of the user. So that is the request. After I've logged in and after I granted all these rights to the client, I was redirected back to my application. So we should see some redirection somewhere here. Here we have it, a HTTP message with the code 302. And this redirection points me back to my application. So let's take out this header, this location header. As you see here, this redirection points me back. Oh, that is the wrong one. Sorry for that. I think, where's the right one? 302. Found. And there should be some location header. Oh, this is the right one. Yeah, that looks quite better. As we see here, I am redirected back to my demonstration application, and as part of this, my application gets some tokens, some very small tokens. There is an identity token, and somewhere below there is this access token. So let's look for access. Here is the access token. And both tokens are JSON web tokens. And perhaps you are wondering, because this doesn't exactly look like JSON. And you are right, that doesn't exactly look like JSON, but you have to know that a JSON web token is just some string that consists of several parts, and those parts are separated by a point. So here we have the first part, and here we have the second part, and the third part. The first part is about the header of the JSON web token. It is just a JSON document that is encoded with base 64. The second part is also encoded with base 64. It is the token that describes the user. And the third part in this case is the digital signature for this token. And when we decode this token, let's base 64 decode it with the text wizard, we see that this token is just a piece of JSON that describes the current user. We see that the current user got some rights, the right OpenID, the right profile, the right email, and the right voucher. And we also see that this token contains further information about the user, things we could use for the authorization and authentication of the user. Things like the given name, things like the family name, things like the email address and whether the email address has been verified, things like whether the user can buy vouchers in bulk. So let's look at the message that we've generated by accessing the resource server. I think for that I have to buy some more vouchers. That looks great. Oh, where is it? Here is it. And when we look at the raw view of this, we see that all these HTTP messages has an authorization header, and this authorization header includes the token. So the client really presents the token to the server to denote that it has the right to act on behalf of the user. So let me just give you a small view to the code I've prepared. We don't have much time, so I will just show you the core of my authentication solution. For this solution, I'm using a small service I've written, a small library. This library provides me with an OAuth service, and this service helps me to do OpenID Connect as well as OAuth 2. And you get all this code afterwards. You can download this code. I will post it on the current Twitter stream. And all we have to do is to tell those service some specific data. You have to tell those service what the URL of the authentication server is. And you have to tell that service what your URL is, the URL you want to get redirected back after logging in. You have to mention the name of your client. You have to mention the scopes you want to get, the rights you want to have delegated. You have to mention the name of the issuer, and you have to say that you want not only to do OAuth 2, but also OpenID Connect. And then I have created this convenience method. This convenience method kicks in my OpenAuth service. It just setups it. It defines some state, some UI router state. Users that aren't logged in are redirected to this state. And then here we have some callback method. This callback method is called after we have been logged in, after we've received the token. And this method gets some context, and this context consists of an access token as well as of the claims, as well as of the information about the user we find within the identity token. And I'm just taking out the access token and creating a default HTTP header with that, a header that is sent to all the services we are accessing via $HTTP. And in addition to that, I'm reading the name of the user to use this name to greet the user and so on. Okay, so much to this little demonstration. As mentioned before, you can have all this code afterwards. So let me come to the conclusion of all this. What did we see? We have seen that OAuth 2 is primarily for the delegation of restricted rights. We have seen that there is something called the implicit grant, and this implicit grant is for single-page applications that want to use OAuth 2. We've seen that OpenID Connect defines how to do authentication with OAuth 2. And we've also seen that OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect allows us for using central user accounts that we can use for several applications. And we have also seen that when we are using OAuth 2, we don't have to pass in our passwords into the client. We just have to show our passwords to the authorization server. So thank you for coming. And if you have any questions, feel free to meet me at the Ask Me Anything room, or feel free to write me a Twitter message or an email. Thank you and have a nice day.